Naslednja je Dorotea Pospihalj, ki je po formaciji psihoanalitičarka, soustanoviteljica psihoanalitične prakse The Red Clinic. Trenutno raziskuje presečišče med filozofijo in psihoanalizo na podiplomski šoli ZRC SAZU, modul transformacije moderne misli, filozofija, psihoanaliza, kultura pod mentorstvom Alenke Zopančič. Doroteja bo predstavila prispevek z naslovom Community without the group, Question of the group formations and the common in the disintegrating world. Izvoli.
Halo. Torej, ja, kot je razvidno iz naslova, bo moj prispevek v angleščini in upam, da to ne bo predstavljalo nekih problemov. Ok, torej. Morris Nitzan was a Jewish analyst specializing in group therapy, also an author of the anti-group theory. Nitzan came to the UK in 1968, where he dedicated his life to the service in the NHS, holding a position of clinical psychologist and a consultant for 52 years. Equally, he was an internationally renowned group analyst, and to top that, a talented artist. Nitzan passed away in 2022, leaving an insignificant legacy in the psychoanalytic theory and praxis, influencing and forming numerous individuals that made further contributions to the psychoanalytic field. And for our purposes today, a brief return to the moment of his visit to Israel in 1998, where he gave a speech at the conference organized in Tel Aviv entitled The Anti-Group, Destructive and Creative Forces in Groups. Opening his address with brief recollection of his past and origin, being a South African Jew by birth, of parents that immigrated from Eastern Europe in the early 20th century, his connections and ties to the Jewish culture, concerning some commonalities or parallels between his home country, being South Africa, and that of Israel. The beginning of his speech hits the very core of what is at stake. And I quote, "I grew up in the shadow of apartheid and became aware early on of a divided society, a society at war with itself," end of quote. Now, Nitzan did not live long enough to have been able to witness the events of the 7th October 2023 and what ensued. Could we even imagine Nitzan addressing a group of fellow analysts in Tel Aviv today, speaking about the divide, the split that is present day literally exploding? Which brings me to the crucial question, namely, what is the role of psychoanalysis in the situation we are faced with today? Can it perhaps address the complexity unfolding in front of our very eyes? Certainly what it can do is offer a way to understand this internal antagonism inherent in the very social fabric, and how it is sublimated or delegated, seemingly unifying the social body again, cancelling all the splits and tensions, of course at the expense of the other, the designated excluded other. We have seen this in Nazi Germany, when that role was assigned precisely to the Jew. And Zizek wrote extensively on this particular problem, formulated the question of the Jew, namely, why does the Nazi need the Jew in order to constitute himself? According to Zizek, the sublime object of ideology is a spectral object which has no positive ontological consistency, but merely fills in the gap of a certain constitutive impossibility. So this is the case for the anti-Semitic figure of the Jew. He bears witness to the fact that the ideological desire which sustains anti-Semitism is inconsistent in itself. It is self-contradictory. For example, the capitalist competition and the idea of some kind of pre-modern organic solidarity. And in order to maintain the desire, a specific object must be invented, which gives body to or externalizes the cause of the non-satisfaction of this very desire. Through this logic, for example, a Jew is responsible for the social disintegration. And it is rather obvious that it is not the Jew who prevents society from existing in some harmonious whole, from realizing its potential of the full organic solidarity. Rather, it is the antagonism that is primordial, constitutive of the society as such, that undermines itself. And the Jew comes in later. It is a secondary formation, a fetish that materializes, as it were, the primordial hindrance and the impossibility. The Jew merely gives the body to the negativity, the impossibility of social antagonism. And it is worth reminding ourselves of the lessons the history provided, which to some extent we failed to grasp, two of such examples that are often compared and seen as two sides of the same problematic coin, namely Nazism and Stalinism. One of the fundamental differences is this. In Nazism, a Jew is ultimately guilty simply because he is a Jew, because of his natural properties, what he fundamentally is. While even in the darkest days of Stalinism, a member of bourgeoisie or aristocracy is not guilty per se. This is because of his social status. There is always a minimum of subjectivization involved, so participation in the class struggle relies on the subjective act of a decision. But you cannot decide to be a Jew. According to this ideology, it is a natural fact. And this underlies the difference all the more, namely what for communists was the antagonisms that dwell in the very kernel of the social edifice was in the Nazi ideology naturalized into a biological property of a specific race. So instead of a notion of society that is traversed, divided by class struggle, in which everybody is compelled to take sides, we get the notion of society as a corporate body threatened by an external enemy, the Jew as a foreign intruder. But this intruder is not simply somewhere outside. It is already part of the very tissue that is constituting the social body. This is what the Nazi propaganda constantly tried to emphasize, that even the so-called assimilated Jew were secretly still Jews at their very core. There is this unalienable core that cannot be changed. Thus, there is no possibility for peaceful coexistence. In that sense, Jews were the absolute other, the principle of corruption embodied. They are not some external threat, but they are, as to use Lacan's term, extimate, indicating that what is inside is in a radical sense exterior. A foreign intruder is thus at the very heart of our civilization. Okay, so according to the psychoanalytic theory, there are certain underlying convictions, destructive tendency perhaps, or what is become to be known as the death drive, Freud's Thanatos, that from the individual unconscious are then transposed or externalized onto the other, which can also be a group. So in Lacanian tradition, this is slightly rethought in a sense that the unconscious tendencies are always already part of the exteriority as such that a subject then inhabits. It is not a formation that somehow originates within the individual. It is always part of the language that then interpolates the subject. Nevertheless, death drive reminds us that not all development, group or individual, lead to progress, namely a positive outcome, and that disintegration, destruction, and termination is very much part of the split that constitutes the speaking being. And the defining characteristics, for example, of anti-group in the group analysis are determined, according to Nitzen, as negative attitudes towards the group, and if not recognized and contained, can disrupt the group and undermine the therapeutic task. And the key aspect being precisely not just the potential destructiveness in the group, but also aggression towards the group as such. The group becomes the other that needs to be destroyed. Elements of the group are interpreted as life-threatening, and these need to be eliminated at all costs. And what needs to be emphasized at this point is that the death drive and the tendency towards destructiveness are processes that are not readily available to articulation. And as it were, they are beyond words, although present on some level of awareness, something that Bolas and Ogden describe as the uncommunicable, unreachable aspect of the psyche, or the unthought known. So this material is usually then pre-verbal, perhaps some early experience of trauma, which preceded the possibility of inscription by speech. Thus the task of recognizing and containing, as it is suggested here, of such processes is fairly difficult, if not an impossible task. But let's persist, nevertheless, with some of the defining features most indicative being that the anti-group is a process and not some fixed entity within the group. They are latent and manifest in form, occurring on all levels of the formation, so from individual to subgroup and group as a whole level. And finally, anti-group is mirrored in the wider sociocultural and political structures. So while Nitzan developed his theory mostly through the processes of group therapy, he did transpose the notion to the groups outside the therapeutic space, wider social fields, which informs the groups constituted by predominant social bonds and their discourses. Essentially what this means is that the dynamics and manifestations of anti-group can be first and foremost noticed within the constituting dimension of the discourse, which is defined by the inherent antagonism. There is no such thing as a discourse without antagonism, in the same way that there is no subject without being a split subject. So social bonds function precisely on the basis of predominant discourses that shape and manage these bonds, tearing with the inherent negativity which constructs and destroys the very fabric. One such bond is the institution of the family, for example. The state of the family today is the institution in crisis. Like many others, there have been historically the core of a Western, as well as many other societies, organizing, regulating aspects of social field. While the institution of the family is in itself dysfunctional, meaning that there is no such thing as a functional family, we are also witnessing the very erosion and disintegration of structures that, albeit dysfunctional, have been predominant organizing principles of the social field. So with the quantitative shift in the socio-symbolic order and the current zeitgeist, which is defined by the never-ending uninterrupted crises, so-called serial crises, that shape and equally, it seems, accelerate the disintegration of the predominant notion of what it means to be part of a society. So the neoliberal project and its emphasis on individualization disintegrated few of the seemingly stable pillars that inscribed an individual into the socio-symbolic order. These two pillars can be said to be family and work. The position of the subject today is the precarious position par excellence in the radical sense of the word. If before it was theorized that dysfunctional families tend to breed further dysfunctional families, producing what Williams called the transmission belts of pathology, today it seems that there is no more reference point on which we could make such an observation. So the notion of anti-group today is very different from the one Nitzan imagined, as the very basis on which the concept is founded is itself disintegrating. If there is no stability in an institution, the very notion of dysfunctional gains a different dimension. If the original anti-group is the family itself, on which all the subsequent anti-group dynamics are based, what happens when the very frame in which the particular dynamics can manifest is in itself perverted? Which brings me to another important point and the defining role of the group, whether it being this original family group or workplace or many other organizations based on a certain type of identification. It is what brings people together at the end of the day, perhaps in the pursuit of a common purpose, cause, what usually provides the individual with a sense of self-worth, belonging, giving meaning to everyday social life. So the proliferation of the identification mechanisms, excessive production of groups and more niche subgroup divisions, at the same time, a certain tendency of disintegration of the old, there seems to be an explosion of new formations based on signifiers that provide the subject with an infinite chain of signifying relations in hope to bridge this gap. The inherent uncertainties becoming more and more apparent in today's ephemeral, yet with no less real consequences of global capitalism. And as Nitzan predicted during the speech in Tel Aviv back in the 1998, and I quote, "There will soon be a generation that knows nothing other than change," end of quote. So how to think of this incessant change, the loss of stability and some clear ethical or moral guidelines that seem to be part of our reality, something that held true up until the recent times. So, European Union, for example, it's such a group that is proclaiming to be the guardian of human rights and the protector of all peoples according to the international law. And it is increasingly becoming clear that this all of people is based on the negativity of the excluded, through which then the positivity is grounded. It is clear that the notion of the community is disintegrating, becoming an impossible notion, perhaps a bad joke. We could certainly say that a community is formed at the expense of exclusion or explosion. And the Israel-Hamas conflict is certainly an example of such an excessive jouissance that Lacan spoke about. And the genocidal efforts against the Palestinians that have been living in the apartheid regime for decades is a tragic consequence of this very monstrous excess of jouissance. And today, for example, in Berlin, the protesters speaking against the brutal violence unfolding in Gaza are not allowed to speak or to write on their banners the word genocide, or to phrase that we heard many times in rallies across Europe and United States, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. So the German authorities have deemed this phrase to carry anti-Semitic sentiment, and what it also suggests is that genocide has been designated to a specific historical moment, isolated, and with that, depoliticized. And by depoliticizing genocides, elevating it to a position of some sublime evil, the exception, paradoxically create the very relativism that we are allegedly trying to avoid, thus creating a hierarchy of political relations, a discourse where some groups are total victims or more victimized than others. And as Zizek pointed out during his inaugural speech at the Frankfurt Book Fair, to be slightly critical today in order to point out the complexity of the situations and refuse to immediately take sides, you are instantly accused of being anti-Semitic. And the question is how to occupy this impossible position today that perhaps insists on some notion of anti-group, or what I would call the not-group principles, avoiding the deadlock of identification with this or that signifier, and at the same time avoiding dangers of relativization and assuming a kind of neutrality, a position of morally or ethically superior stance, which could be self-righteous ignorance par excellence. In today's conception of somewhat paradoxical neoliberal pro-freedom cancel culture, the official notice seems to be yes to inclusion and diversity, but on the grounds of exclusion of those who do not fit our notions of inclusions and diversity. And to conclude, in the perverse reactionary times that we live in today, where we are forced to identify ourselves, take sides in all matter of things, perhaps the most radical thing to do is precisely to organize in a slightly different way, to return to the loneliness of the subjective experience in relation to one's own singular jouissance.